The Nazis built Auschwitz like a fortress, ringed by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards. They didn't expect anyone to escape, let alone fight back. But in the fall of 1944, a secret network was forming in the camp. Prisoners passed coded messages, smuggled gunpowder in grain sacks, and fashioned knives from scraps of metal, preparing for the ultimate rebellion. The plan was ambitious. The prisoners would blow up the crematoria and cut the fences. Then a handful of fighters would confront their Nazi tormentors, allowing other prisoners time to escape. The architects of the plan knew the odds were against them. They were emaciated prisoners of the world's most feared extermination camp, facing the might of the Nazi machine with a few grains of gunpowder and a handful of makeshift knives. They knew they were unlikely to survive, and that if they did, their punishments would be agonizing. So, how did a handful of starving prisoners organize an uprising in Auschwitz? Every arrival at Auschwitz followed a sequence of hellish choreography designed to inflict maximum pain. Armed SS guards and their dogs would force dazed prisoners off the trains. A Nazi doctor would decide who looked strong enough to work and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. From there, the Sonderkommando, or special squads, took over. But special squads is a cruelly misleading title, because these men were prisoners too. Jews forced to lead their own people into hell. It was their job to escort prisoners to the gas chambers and wait as the gas did its work. Then, they'd open the doors and strip the bodies of rings and gold teeth, erasing every trace of the victims' humanity before loading them into the crematoria. Fully aware that soon, it would be their turn too. Because for Jews at Auschwitz, all roads led to the flames. Some prisoners just took a longer time to get there. The Sonderkommando didn't warn new arrivals about where they were going. There was no point. They had no weapons, no means to fight back. Silence was the only mercy they had to offer. There are no words for the horrors the Sonderkommando endured. Many broke or lost their minds entirely, but some found a reason to keep going despite their ghoulish task: resistance. In the hell of Auschwitz, resistance took many forms. One was documentation. On scraps of paper, on bottles and cans, prisoners wrote of the atrocities unfolding around them and buried the evidence deep in the earth, hoping that there would be someone left to find it. One Sonderkommando reflected on the futility of the exercise. It may be that these very lines I'm writing will be the only witnesses to what was my life. And yet, he continued, I will be happy if my writings reach you, free citizen of the world. It was a meager hope to pin a future on, but those meager hopes were all the Sonderkommando had: hope and the will to resist. On the other side of the barbed wire, the Polish underground had managed to establish underground schools, newspapers, courts, social services, a secret parliament, and even a military wing, and they were horrified by what was happening behind Auschwitz's forbidding metal gates. So they established a smuggling pipeline, a fragile link between Auschwitz and the outside world. Sonderkommando risked everything to smuggle evidence of the atrocities out of the camp, and in return, the Polish underground smuggled in gunpowder, contraband, and tools. At the heart of this pipeline were Jewish women. Rosa Robota was 21 years old, the only surviving member of her family. As they were dragged to the gas chambers, she was sent to work in the munitions factory, and it was there that she hatched a plan as bold as it was dangerous. She convinced her fellow prisoners to smuggle out gunpowder, a handful at a time. 20 fearless women answered Rosa's call. They secretly collected grains of gunpowder like fragments of hope, hiding them in rags, clothing hems, and small containers. Then, they slipped this precious contraband to the Sonderkommando by posing as close friends or even lovers to mask the exchange. Of course, they had no guns, but they could use the gunpowder to blow up at least one of the crematoria. This smuggling operation was the sole pinprick of light in the darkness of Auschwitz. The prisoners' dream of an uprising was all that sustained them. They knew they had no hope of destroying the camp. They were beaten, exhausted, starved, and outgunned. But the hope of bringing the camp to its knees was electrifying, the only force that kept them going. And they had nothing left to lose. They hinged their hopes on handfuls of gunpowder and makeshift weapons. One Sonderkommando survivor named Eliezer Eisenschmidt forged bayonets from items confiscated from Jewish transports. Items like knives, which Jewish prisoners had packed, hoping they would have a chance to slice their Shabbat challah in the camp. Of course, there was no Shabbat challah at Auschwitz, so these sacred items were melted into weapons, a poignant symbol of Jewish resistance. After over a year of preparation, they were as ready as they'd ever be. They had their makeshift weapons. They had peppered crematorium 4 with gunpowder. They had identified the guards they wanted to take down, and they had a plan. First, they'd cut the power supply, which would stop communications between the guards and disable the electric fences. Prisoners could then cut the wires and escape, while the Sonderkommando destroyed the gas chambers and crematoria. They knew what would happen to those who lingered, but the Talmud tells us that whoever saves a life saves an entire world. Against their will, they had ushered countless souls into hell. This was their atonement, their final act of rebellion. The prisoners did everything they could to keep their plans quiet, but somehow the Nazis caught wind of the revolt. They sent a ruthless officer to interrogate the leader of the Sonderkommando, but when he refused to rat out his peers, the Nazis shot him publicly. A warning. Then they identified another 100 men to be transported to the gas chambers. If the Sonderkommando wanted to stop this transport, it was now or never. On October 7th, 1944, just hours before 100 men were scheduled to be sent to the gas chambers, the Sonderkommando erupted into action, setting multiple crematoria on fire. The gunpowder stored within the wall of crematorium 4 ignited a fierce blaze, and the building crumbled to the ground, the only crematorium destroyed during the Holocaust. As the crematoria burned, prisoners cut holes in the fence wire, and some managed to escape to a nearby forest. All the while, Sonderkommando fought their guards with everything they had: fists, makeshift knives, and the white-hot rage of people with nothing left to lose. They managed to eliminate 3 guards and injure another 10. But soon, the SS put down the revolt, shooting 250 prisoners in a matter of hours, including many of the Sonderkommando ringleaders. By the end of the day, the revolt was over, extinguished before it really began. Among the victims was young Załmen Gradowski, who had buried his testimony near the crematoria. Later, the Polish underground would criticize the Sonderkommando. The Red Army was drawing near. If the prisoners had just waited, the Soviet military might have changed the entire equation, they claimed. If any of their Sonderkommando contacts had been left to answer them, they might have argued that the fantasy of the Red Army was just that: speculation dreamed up by people who had never been to Auschwitz, people who still had the luxury of time, of believing that their liberation was at hand. But the prisoners of Auschwitz had none of these luxuries, and the Polish underground never got any answers about why the prisoners hadn't waited. There was no one left to give them. The SS did everything they could to root out the ringleaders, and the interrogations were not quick. But despite weeks of abuse, the prisoners refused to talk. The Nazis had taken everything from them. All they had left were their souls. If they had to go to their graves, they would do so with honor and defiance. As the hangman placed the noose around her neck, Rosa Rabota shouted out to the watching crowd, "Sisters, revenge." A final rallying cry from a woman who refused to be defeated. But there was no more appetite for revolt among the prisoners of Auschwitz. Revenge was a distant fantasy. The price was simply too high, so Auschwitz kept swallowing Jews and spitting out smoke. The Red Army did finally arrive in January of 1945. By then, only 60 Sonderkommando were still alive, like their murdered brothers before them who hid evidence of the Nazi atrocities in the earth, waiting for a witness. They made it their mission to tell the world what they had endured. One surviving Sonderkommando named Shlomo Venezia even became a celebrated author, a frequent guest on television and in schools, and a consultant on the film Life is Beautiful. The world doesn't talk much about the Auschwitz Uprising. Compared to the revolt of the Warsaw Ghetto or the defiance of the Bielski brothers, this rebellion was a failure. Or was it? The Sonderkommando weren't naive. They knew they were unlikely to survive their uprising. But physical survival was never their goal. Defiance was. A reminder that an inner flame burns inside us all, and even in hell, it is impossible to extinguish. As the young Sonderkommando Załmen Gradowski wrote to his hypothetical audience before the uprising claimed his life, perhaps a spark of my inner fire will ignite in you, and you will fulfill at least part of our life's desire. You shall avenge our deaths. There is no avenging 6 million ghosts, no human justice that can tip the scale. But perhaps the best vengeance is memory, a reminder that even Auschwitz could not erase future generations from remembering the past.